Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes. Only, this is the verbatim federal courtroom testimony of the Sean Diddy Combs trial as reported by Inner City Press. The courtroom was tense as a surprise witness stepped forward. A woman no one expected, yet who had seen it all. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a former flame. She was Diddy's former maid. For years, she cleaned up after his most private parties, signing strict NDAs and staying silent. But now her silence was over. She spoke about burned contracts, red-stained bedsheets, and eerie objects tossed carelessly into trash bins. But the most disturbing find, a scorched passport photo of a missing girl, the same girl the world had forgotten. Until today, gasps echoed through the courtroom as the evidence was revealed. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table, visibly shaken. What this maid witnessed behind closed doors wasn't just disturbing, it was damning, and for the first time, the world saw a version of Diddy. He tried so hard to hide this testimony could change everything. She walked in, wearing all black, a simple dress, no makeup, and her hair tied back in a way that said, "I didn't come here for attention." True, her name was withheld for her safety, but she was known simply in court documents as Housekeeper X, and as she sat in the witness chair, there was a noticeable shift in the courtroom. Cameras weren't allowed, but reporters in the room noted how Diddy leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, sunglasses still on, until she opened her mouth. She introduced herself. Softly, she had worked for Diddy between 2014 and 2020, employed under a private contract to maintain discretion and ensure confidentiality. She wasn't part of the party crowd. She wasn't in the videos. She was the one who cleaned up what was left behind after everyone else had gone home or passed out. "I saw a lot," she said, glancing quickly toward the defense table. "I didn't understand most of it. At the time, I just did my job." But on one particular Monday morning, after what she described as one of the worst after-parties she'd ever cleaned, something happened that changed everything. She arrived at the Beverly Hills estate at 6:15 a.m. The house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. Usually there's music still playing or a chef prepping breakfast. But that morning it was just silence. She started her routine trash removal. Came first, Sherry called, dragging one of the large bins from the main hallway into the service garage. As she began sorting through their recyclables, she noticed a smell coming from one of the burn cans, a mix of plastic smoke and something sharp inside. Were ashes, but not just from paper. Among them were half-melted photo frames, a scorched manila folder, and wedged between them, the fragment of a passport photo. "I wasn't supposed to look," she admitted, "but it didn't feel right. Something about it was wrong." That's when the judge leaned forward. The prosecutor raised a copy of the very photo fragment she had reported. It was charred and blurred, but still visible. The half-smiling face of a teenage girl. The jury studied it silently. Diddy closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. This was the beginning of what the prosecution would call the House of Ashes and the Maid. This quiet, overlooked woman was about to become its most devastating witness as the courtroom settled. Housekeeper X took a breath, gripped her hands in her lap, and continued. She described how she rarely saw the main events. The celebrity-studded parties that filled Diddy's homes with flashing lights, booming speakers, and endless drinking. But what followed those events was where the real story began. They called them the after parties. She said that's when everyone who was supposed to leave. Didn't the lights went dimmer? The security got tighter. Phones were locked away in velvet-lined pouches, and the guests different, she whispered, not always celebrities. Some looked nervous, some Looked very young, she said. Her cleaning. Instructions on those nights always included very specific directions. Do not enter the east wing bedrooms. Do not clean the downstairs. Do only take trash from the designated zones, but she admitted to violating those rules more than once. Not out of rebellion, but out of fear. She had been warned by a fellow housekeeper, once you don't want to be the one who finds something and says nothing one night. While cleaning the guest bathroom, she found a blood-stained towel rolled tightly and jammed behind the toilet. She called security. They removed it. Without a word, another time she was assigned to the main hall after a party and noticed strange marks on the hardwood floor, deep scratches that looked like something heavy had been dragged across it. But the worst. The ritual table, she said it was a long wooden dining table covered in melted candle wax, burnt photographs, broken glass feathers, and she hesitated. What looked like dried blood. I wasn't told to clean it, she said, but I had to walk past it every morning. No one ever touched it. It just sat there 4 days. One time, it was gone completely. The next week, it was back. The judge asked her if she reported this to anyone. She shook her head. I had signed so many papers. I didn't want to end up like the others, who just disappeared. The courtroom was silent again. Not even the defense attorneys interrupted, because the air had changed. The words, "ritual" and "disappeared," were now in the air, and they wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. What she found in the trash wasn't a one-time occurrence. It became a pattern, a cycle. Every time there was an after-event, the same items would reappear like clockwork: charred paper, torn receipts, half-burned Polaroids, and disturbingly more photos of people she didn't recognize. One night she noticed an envelope with a red stamp that read. She picked it up. Inside were 5 torn-up contracts with blacked-out names and pages that mentioned agreement of participation and full compliance. Each was stained, folded, and smelled like alcohol and smoke. At the very bottom was a $100 bill torn straight down the center. She testified that she brought these fragments home scared, but unable to ignore what she saw for weeks. She kept them in a small lockbox under herbed. It wasn't until a month later, while at a grocery store, that the full horror clicked into place. On the community board near the front entrance was a missing persons flyer. A teenage girl named Malia, last seen at a yacht party in 2016. Her face was nearly identical to the passport photo she had found in the trash weeks earlier. She froze, dropped her groceries, walked out of the store. "I couldn't breathe," she told the jury. "It felt like my chest collapsed when she got home." She retrieved the burnt photo and compared it again. The same eyebrows, the same dimples, the same slight freckle near the left cheek. This was no coincidence. She emailed the photo anonymously to a tip line, but never heard back. She felt watched. After that, her phone. Acting strange, someone parked across from her house for hours. She moved apartments, changed numbers, and quit the job not long after. She told the courtroom, "I never wanted to be part of any of this, but I couldn't carry it anymore. Not after Kim died, not after Malia went missing, not after what I saw in the trash." The courtroom once again was stunned. The defense had no objections, because sometimes silence says everything. The prosecution placed a sealed evidence bag on the table inside a single sheet of scorched paper. The edges were blackened, some text unreadable, but in the center, where words burned into memory, "guest entry protocol," followed by a list of names, or at least aliases. The maid stared at it. She took a deep breath. "That's one of the pages I found near the fireplace," she said. Her voice shook slightly, but she didn't stop. She told the court that Diddy had a routine the morning after his most exclusive events. Before anyone arrived, he would sit in his den, curtains closed, fireplace, roaring music, barely audible. And that's when he would burn things, sometimes. It was magazines, or old paperwork, she said, but there were also tapes, notebooks, even stacks of what looked like contracts. She described one morning when she entered the room, earlier than usual, and saw him tossing something thick and bound, a black journal, into the fire as he turned and saw her. She froze. He didn't yell. She said, "He just stared at me for a long time and said, 'You didn't see that?' Then he handed me an envelope of cash. The envelope was labeled silence. This wasn't paranoia. She was being paid not just to clean, but to forget. What made it the courtroom shift again was her account of what she called the vault room, a door in the west. Wing hallway, always locked, always guarded. No staff were allowed in. But one afternoon, while delivering dry cleaning to a guest suite, she found the door slightly open. Inside was a soundproof room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, each shelf held labeled Mini. DV tapes and memory cards stored in neat rows. Some were labeled with first name, others with dates. But many were marked with only one thing: numbers she took. A single step in, before a man appeared behind her turnaround, he said, his handle ready, reaching for his waistband. She did. "I didn't even speak," she said. "I just nodded and walked back to the kitchen." I knew I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. From that day forward, she was no longer scheduled on days following Diddy's most secretive events. She said her role was reassigned: only clean. Before parties, never after. She was being boxed out, silenced, and eventually let go with a severance package and a warning. They told me if I ever spoke about anything I saw, she paused, I'd disappear. To the judge. Didn't flinch. The jurors didn't blink. But Diddy hestered straight at the floor. The photo was displayed on the courtroom monitor, enhanced, zoomed, clarified as much as it could be. It showed the left half of a teenage girl's face, slightly smiling, hair pulled back, a small freckle under the eye. The maid nodded slowly. "That's the one I found in the trash," she said. Gasps could be heard from the gallery. The prosecution followed immediately, with a large display board, side-by-side comparisons on the left. The enhanced passport photo fragment on the right, a missing persons flyer from 2016. Malia J. Chatton, aged 17. Last seen attending a private yacht party off the Miami coast. The resemblance was undeniable, and the timeline matched exactly with one of Diddy's notorious invite-only summer parties. "I didn't know who she was when I found it," the maid explained. "But when I saw her poster later, I couldn't unsee it. That's the same girl." Prosecutors pressed her further. Had she seen Malia in person? "No," she said. "But I remembered seeing a girl who looked like her on one of the party screens just for a second, like someone walking behind a crowd. Then she was gone." Forensic analysts confirmed the photo came from aerial passport. Though it had been partially destroyed, the ID number was melted, but the ink from the government watermark was still traceable. The courtroom tensed as the prosecution said it out loud. "This is now a missing persons investigation, not just a misconduct case." Diddy looked up for the first time in an hour, his eyes locked on the screen. He didn't blink, he didn't move. But one reporter noted a twitch at the corner of his mouth. The maid continued her testimony, recalling how after that particular weekend the house had been in chaos. Extra cleaners were brought in. The usual party crew was nowhere to be seen. A member of security quit the next week. She recalled a chilling conversation Shoover heard between two male assistants whispering in the garage. One said, "She freaked out. Should have never let her in the bedroom." The other replied, "It's handled, but we need to get rid of everything now." That was the same day She found the photo in the trash at that point. The courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was scared. Diddy's public image has always been unshakable, cool, confident, composed, but in this courtroom on this day that image began to fall apart. At first he sat, still his face was unreadable, but as the maid's testimony dragged deeper, with details about missing girls, burned tapes, and cash-stuffed silence, envelopes, something started to shift. His right leg began to shake under the table. He clenched his jaw, and every time the prosecution mentioned the photo or the trash evidence, he looked away. One of the defense attorneys leaned over to whisper something, but Diddy waved him off. His hand trembled slightly, and then came the moment. The prosecution replayed a snippet from the maid's earlier deposition. It was an audio recording. In it, she described how, when she once asked another staffer why the fireplace was always burning, he replied, "That's how the truth dies around here." Or, the word shit like a thunderclap. Diddy exhaled heavily and buried his face in his hands. One juror, visibly startled, shifted in her seat. The court sketch artist scribbled furiously, capturing the precise moment a billionaire mogul broke in front of a jury. Then came another blow. The judge approved the admission of the passport photo and the burned contract fragments. As evidence, the defense objected, citing lack of direct proof. The judge dismissed it outside the courtroom. Reporters called it the moment. The mask fell off inside. Diddy began to sweat through his suit. His hand gripped the table edge. At one point, a tissue was passed down to him. He accepted it. Wiped his eyes. It was the first time anyone saw Diddy cry in court, not over a lost deal, not over an accusation, but over the evidence that might finally expose everything he fought to keep hidden. After the maid's devastating testimony, the prosecution presented something new, a series of audio clips and written statements from former House staff, who, while too afraid to testify publicly, offered corroboration under protective conditions. The first clip was a voice, shaky but firm. "I used to work events at the East Wing. We had to surrender our phones once I caught someone trying to film something strange happening near the downstairs. Dense security tackled him. We never saw him again." The courtroom murmured. The second clip played a woman, this time possibly in her late 30s, said, "I quit after I found my paycheck came with an NDA. In either signed. I was told I had already agreed. When I refused, I got a phone call from an unlisted number telling me I'd ruin my life if I pushed back." Each clip layered the tension, but what shook the courtroom most was a written statement from a former security contractor. It detailed a secret protocolist at Diddy's private party's guests who became too loud, too exposed, or emotionally unstable were escorted to what they called Room 17. This room wasn't on the floor plan, it wasn't in the security system, but it existed behind a mirrored panel in the East Wing inside Room 17. The statement described padded walls, a single bed, a mounted camera, and a metal file cabinet filled with personal folders. Each folder allegedly contained NDs, Polaroids, and what the guard described as leverage material. The judge ordered the details stricken from the formal record until verification, but the press had already picked it up. Social media exploded within minutes of recess. The maid's testimony had cracked the door open, but now the entire world was peeking inside. Until now, Kim Porter's name had remained largely in the background, respectfully shielded from the day's testimony, but the prosecution made it clear we cannot ignore the connection between what this maid saw and what happened to Ms. Porter. Kim, the mother of 3 of Diddy's children, was found unresponsive in her home in November 2018. The official report labeled it a sudden case of lobar pneumonia, but her final days were strange. Friends said she was paranoid. She reportedly told family members, If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident. D. The maid testified that in the weeks before Kim's death, she saw things change inside the mansion. He stopped throwing parties for her while he seemed nervous, and the trash was different. She recalled finding a manila folder labeled K-Fin vinyl in the kitchen. Trash. She didn't open it, but she remembered something else. That same day, a voicemail from Kim had come through on the house line. It was short. It was panic. She was crying. The message was deleted within minutes by another staff member, but the maid remembered. One line vividly. "They know I'm going to talk. I just don't want to die for it." At that moment, in court, the judge turned to the jury. "This information," he said, "will not be treated as conclusive. But the witnesses' statements are part of a broader narrative." The defense objected. The objection was noted, but the effect had already taken root. Kim Porter's death was no longer being treated as an isolated tragedy. It was now a thread in a dark, tangled web, and this maid might have just yanked on the end of it. The final part of the maid's testimony focused on the thing that started it all. The trash. For years, it had been ignored, disposed of, burned, forgotten. But now every torn envelope, every scorched paper, every discarded photograph had come back to haunt the man who thought his secrets were safe. The maid presented a final piece, a sealed plastic bag she had kept for years in a storage unit, afraid to destroy it, too scared to reveal it. Inside were burned Polaroids, partially melted memory cards, and handwritten notes, with names and dates. "I didn't understand what it meant at the time," she said, "but now I know it was insurance." The prosecution requested that the contents be submitted into evidence under strict protective custody. The judge approved. Then something unexpected happened. Diddy stood up. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He just walked toward the exit and whispered something to his lawyer. Moments later, the judge called an emergency recess reporters outside, where he stunned the courtroom didn't reconvene for 2 hours. And when it did, Diddy's seat remained empty. Rumors swirled: mental breakdown, flight risk, collapse in the hallway. But what was clear was this: the maid had changed everything. What began as a quiet, overlooked testimony became the cornerstone of one of the most shocking courtroom moments in modern celebrity history. And as the gavel fell, the world realized sometimes the truth doesn't come from a celebrity. It comes from the person who cleaned up after.